In the run-up to the next general election, both Labour and the Tories are competing on who can be toughest on crime. The latest iteration of that debate, sparked by Transport Minister Richard Holden, is about whether we should build more prisons to lock up shoplifters. And on the Jeremy Vine show, that prompted a broader debate on the relationship between policing and crime. This is Grace Blakeley debating Mike Parry.
This idea that we could just stop crime by having more police on the streets is just demonstrably false.
Well, arrest criminals.
We know that it's not true.
They are a deterrent.
If you want to stop crime, you have to look at the root causes of crime. We've had for decades a long-term fall in violent crime until about 5 years ago when we started to see violent crime increase again. Now, why has that happened?
Brexit.
It's because we are facing a bit of a social breakdown.
Definitely.
That's not just because people have suddenly all gone mad. It's because there are really deep-rooted problems in our society, in things like, the children's social care system, around, how we deal with youth offending, in education, in health. And that is, I think, the problem.
I might sound old-fashioned, but in the year I was born, there was still rationing, OK? Believe it or not, rationing after the Second World War. Nobody was going into co-op stores and stealing stuff in those days, and nobody had any food, and nobody had any money. So, honestly...
But I think there is actually a point there, right, which is there's a difference between there being scarcity and a sense that everyone's in it together, and then the situation we're in now, where you have extreme levels of inequality, where you have a few people at the very top who have everything they could ever want, and then a lot of people looking at that thinking, I can barely afford to eat, so why should I bother, obeying the rules?
I thought that was a really smart response there from Grace to Mike Parry. I mean, in a way, there might be a simpler one. Like, are you sure no one shoplifted in the 1950s? Like, I would quite like to see some evidence for that claim. I'm sure I suppose we're talking about the 1940s here because of rationing, but I'm sure during that period of rationing, there were quite a lot of people stealing things. I mean, there was, of course, famously, a very large black market. So the idea that no one used to commit crimes seems a little bit silly to me. Overall, I think Grace's point there was excellent, really well made. I slightly disagree with one thing, though. The first thing Grace said there is a bunch actually of good evidence that increasing the number of police does reduce to some extent violent crime. That doesn't mean we should necessarily do it, but I think on the left we probably do need to at least admit it. This is from a Vox article summarising the data as it relates to the United States. A 2020 study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research concluded each additional police officer abates approximately 0.1 homicides. In per capita terms, effects are twice as large for black versus white victims. A 2005 study in the Journal of Law and Economics took advantage of surges in policing driven by terror alerts, finding that high alert periods when more officers were deployed led to significantly less crime. A 2016 study published by the Public Library of Science looked at what happened when more New York City police officers were deployed in high crime areas as part of an effort called Operation Impact, concluding these deployments were associated with less crime across the board. Now, if results like that can be replicated in the UK, we would expect the cuts to policing during austerity to have had some effect on crime rates. And those cuts were big from 2010 onwards. Police budgets were cut by 20%, and the rate of reported crimes that went on to be solved completely collapsed. These are how charge rates have changed for various types of reported crime since 2015. Now, this is pretty phenomenal. So this is the Tories' record on crime, essentially. So assault without injury, it used to be the case that 16% of reported crimes went on to charge. It's now 3%. Assault with injury, it used to be the case that 25% of reported crimes went on to charge and prosecution. It's now only 5%. Now you can look at all different sorts of crime, and the rate at which these are solved has absolutely collapsed. Now, one would expect that to decrease the deterrent effect of committing a crime, right? So if you have the police no longer solving crimes, one would expect that to some degree, mean that there is less of a deterrent to not do crime. So I slightly disagree with Grace on that point. One thing, though, where she is absolutely correct is that policing shouldn't be the main way of tackling crime. Inequality, as she says, is much more important. Now, this is a fascinating article in The Guardian from a few years back, which Grace sent me, actually, summarising the research on this. So the headline here, the surprising factors driving murder rates, income, inequality, and respect. And it's by Maya Salovitz. She's got this inequality predicts homicide rates better than any other variable, says an expert. The article explains how it's a sense of low status on the part of the perpetrator that leads to much violent crime. This is an example which the article gives. When someone bumps into someone on the dance floor, looks too long at someone else's girlfriend, or makes an insulting remark, it doesn't threaten the self-respect of people who have other types of status the way it can when you feel this is your only source of value. Now, I think that's really smart. That seems incredibly intuitive to me. I feel that in my own life. Sometimes you'll get disrespected in the street by someone, and you might think, oh, I really need to respond to that. This is a real blow to how I feel about myself. But I get my sense of well-being, my sense of worth from other areas than how I'm treated on the street. This is not, I'm not treated particularly badly on the street. I don't think London is full of crime, as some people on Twitter might want you to think. Nick Timothy, one of them, in fact, just been selected as a Tory MP. But I do think that makes a big difference to how one responds to situations such as that. It's also intuitive that high levels of inequality and low levels of opportunity increase the number of people in this situation where you don't have many sources of a sense of status, so you do react to what one might think of as minor things in such a way. The statistics also seems to back this up. So Salovitz writes this: according to the World Bank, a simple measure of inequality predicts about half of the variance in murder rates between American states and between countries around the world. When inequality is high and strips large numbers of men of the usual markers of status, like a good job and the ability to support a family, matters of respect and disrespect loom disproportionately. Inequality predicts homicide rates better than any other variable, says Martin Daly, Professor Emeritus of Psychology and Neuroscience at McMaster University in Ontario, and author of Killing the Competition, Economic Inequality and Homicide. This includes factors like rates of gun ownership, which also rise when inequality does, and cultural traits like placing more emphasis on honor. This too turns out to be linked with inequality. And then there's a quote from Richard Wilkinson, author of The Spirit Level and co-founder of the Equality Trust. He says, about 60 academic papers show that a very common result of greater inequality is more violence, usually measured by homicide rates. Emma, what did you think of Grace's argument there, and where do you stand on this debate when crime perennially comes up in sort of public discourse? How do you tend to respond?
There's like a UK study from 2011 called Police Numbers and Crime Rates. And they actually argue in that in the UK, the evidence is inconclusive to say that there's a strong association between police numbers and violent crime. They find that there's maybe a stronger correlation between police numbers and property crime. Yeah, absolutely. The fact that inequality is one of the biggest drivers of crime. And many years ago, I studied violence, conflict, and development when we were looking at states, countries that had very, very pronounced violence. There was a far stronger correlation between contexts where there was sharp and vast inequality than where there was poverty. So poverty alone itself isn't a driver of violence in the same way as poverty cheek to jowl with wealth is. So there's very strong relationship between inequality and violence. And I think that's also fascinating, that Guardian article, because I've not read it or seen that before, but something that I've spoken about, so just speculatively, kind of anecdotally, I have nothing that I've researched or anything, but just in different social spheres that I have lived in, I've definitely kind of speculated about that idea that how people behave in public space and the value that is attached to kind of respect in public space does seem to really correlate with the arguments that are being made in that article, and where people have less status. Certainly there, and again, this is just anecdotally, but something that I've definitely witnessed and observed is that the kind of social relations in public space where there are lower status people, I've experienced, kind of more violence. People can kind of afford to be more genteel not because they're better people or nicer people, but because they don't have to necessarily assert themselves in public spaces like that, because they have other spheres of influence and status. So I think that's fascinating that there's research that supports that.
That's one article where I read it and I found it really, really like intuitive. It just made sense to me. Of course, it is important to keep this whole debate in perspective. When we hear that crime is soaring, that's often based on police records, which do show crime to be historically rather high. The problem with that, though, is that it's affected by how inclined people are to report crime and how the police decide to record them. So the Office for National Statistics suggests their police and crime survey is a better measure. This graph from the Times shows the difference the measure we use makes. So in yellow is the number of crimes reported to the police each year. As you can see, that was around 5 million per year in 2003 when these records began. Those numbers fell consistently until 2015 when they started to increase. So reported crimes going up. The black line, though, shows how many crimes the Office for National Statistics think took place every year based on interviews they do with respondents. This is sort of a random survey that you do with a representative sample. Now, on that measure, crimes per year peaked at around 20 million in 1995 and has been declining ever since. So according to the ONS, that decline hasn't stopped. So whereas you see this uptick in reported crime, estimated crime based on interviews of people and surveys suggests it is still falling. There were 5 million, or less than 5 million, in fact, estimated crimes in 2022. That's half the number that we had in 2010 and a quarter of the number in 1995. Emma, if the arrow is going in the right direction, so if crime is going down, should we just forget about it? Whenever sort of a politician brings up crime on the telly, should we just say, look, it's falling, stop with this fear-mongering?
No, I don't think we should just forget about crime. But at the same time, I find it like really alarming that both parties are using are using kind of a fear of crime or this idea that they're tough on crime as one of their kind of like main campaigning tools. I think it's definitely, just part of the dynamic of trying to blame the kind of most vulnerable people in society for the kind of for the ills of society. So I think we really have to consider like how we think and talk about crime.